I'll say two things. I mean, the first thing was, I mean, something we just have to acknowledge is that, as it turned out, Black Power it was perfectly compatible with being incorporated without a revolution. And this is where, I mean, Cedric's book, From Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, gets into this. But the first official Black Power conference was in Newark in 1967. They had conferences in 68 and 69. And you look at the platforms they produced, you know, demands like community control, demands like buy Black campaigns, more Black politicians, you know, and this is why I kind of constantly come back to, why do we necessarily view Black Power as more radical than some of the mainstream civil rights movements? So a lot of it was perfectly compatible with the system without necessarily a revolution. The other thing I'll say, I think, which is interesting when it comes to the Black political class that participated in the Gary convention, so some of these mayors, these Black Congress people, you know, and this is part of how politics has just shifted to the right, the center of gravity. But if you look at these first Black politicians, a lot of them were, by standards of today, very good. I mean, you know, they were advocating social democratic policies. They came out of civil rights and labor, these sort of things. And their argument out of Gary, which I think we should give a lot of credence to, was like, you know, look, we actually have constituencies. The Congress of African Peoples, which was Amiri Baraka's organization, what exactly is their base? It's not really clear. We have a constituency we actually have to respond to. And I think another thing going against them was, again, the structural factors. And they made a very astute point, was like, you know, you want to talk about community control, but at the end of the day, the issues affecting Black people in cities are not city level institutions. So yeah, let's take over the school district. I mean, look, Philadelphia right now, the whole school board is Black, but the funding that actually would make schools, you know, humane and how they should be, comes at the state and federal level. So you want to focus on like institutions of the ghetto. And Gary Hatcher, who was mayor of Gary, made a very good point of like, you know, at the end of the day, I actually don't really control the jobs and the resources for my constituents. Like, these things are really at the federal level. These are in the hands of corporations. So, but a lot of these mayors, it was kind of bad timing as well. They came in to power right as, you know, these jobs are leaving the inner cities, there's less federal funding. So in a way, it was very bad timing for them to be able to fulfill the agenda that they wanted to.
It's mayors of these cities like Gary. Who else where else was there a Black mayor?
Newark.
Cleveland, these were former industrial hubs, if I'm not mistaken, correct? So these guys are coming in right at the time where all these jobs are leaving in these cities. Why are these cities so dominated by Black people, population-wise?
Not the Great Society, the
migration.
It was the Great Migration, right? The Great Migration that takes Black people active. Don't forget, there's two Great Migrations. You have the first wave of the Great Migration that goes forth from the early 20th century up until World War II, and there's a second Great Migration that goes after World War II up until the late 60s as well. So we have these two periods of times where you have Black people who are moving in large numbers from the South into the Northeast, into the Midwest, into major urban areas, trying to find a better way of life than they were finding in the agrarian South, where they were relegated to sharecropping and domestic labor.
Throw out there for my own, you know, home state of New Jersey that when Black folks are moving up from the South and also trying to get into the suburbs, especially during post World War II, like suburb boom, places like New Jersey, and I'm sure a lot of other states have similar processes like this, but New Jersey multiple times went to the state Supreme Court whether or not you had to allow low-income housing, particularly for Black folks. It's a fight that starts in like the 1950s with a woman named Ethel Lawrence. And it just goes decade after decade where they find different ways to block low-income housing. But one of the rules they eventually came up with, at least in New Jersey, was one town could sell its share of the low-income burden to another town. And cash-strapped towns like Newark, Camden, places that kind of lost money after, they stopped being industrial hubs, they were willing to buy the low-income housing burden from the surrounding areas, but it just annihilated their tax base. So that's why, at least in places like New Jersey, you have a lot of towns where it's just all the poor people seem to be there, but it's because they, they were willing to take money to take on more of the poor folks in the surrounding areas.
Paul, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just kind of going back to what Pascal said. I mean, he's right. I mean, the fundamental flaw in this Gary project was this idea that there could be this unity. And the slogan was unity without uniformity. And I think that was a way for them to kind of try and justify that, like, well, yes, we're not going to all do the same thing, but we have this broad-based unity. And I think, Baraka was motivated by this because he was involved in an effort in Newark to elect the first Black mayor, Kenneth Gibson. And I think in many areas, there was kind of this interesting dynamic where you had these, so-called radical Black nationalists interacting with more mainstream figures and getting people elected. So I think he had this idea that we can take this model in Newark and create this broad unity nationally. And in a sense, I mean, the Gary convention was impressive. I mean, you have Coretta Scott King with Betty Shabazz, with radical Black nationalists who call them Marxists, with members of the Congressional Black Caucus. I mean, it'd be hard to kind of imagine that gathering happening today. So in that sense, you look at it and it's like, wow, this is impressive. But once you start getting into the details, you just can't paper over these divisions. And, they produced this Black agenda out of Gary. And, you can look at it and there's a lot of very great things in there, national health care, full employment, public transit, every kind of thing you would want in there, anti-imperialist things. But again, there's a fundamental contradiction where it includes things that are pro-integration, mainstream civil rights things. And then on the other hand, it also says, we also want to create 5 Black states and, some elements that are
where were the Black states?
I forget, to be honest.
In the South, it just comes out of the Republic of New Africa.
But it includes elements that kind of show like we believe that we can change the system, and also elements that are like, no, the system's gone, we got to do our own thing. So it's like, okay, you can create this agenda and it kind of looks impressive and it's smart people writing this stuff, but you can't operationalize it. And it's kind of showed as soon as the convention ended, the Congressional Black Caucus people were like, well, let's create our own platform that's kind of the same, but a little bit watered down. And there's also this idea that we're going to go into the 1972 presidential election with a unified strategy. Again, kind of immediately broke down. I mean, Jesse Jackson was at Gary calling for an independent Black political party. A few months later, he's at the DNC campaigning for McGovern. But again, it kind of was just based on this assumption we can achieve this unity. Just put all the important Black people in a room, and it's going to be great. And it just couldn't work out that way. There were too many differences, ideological differences, class differences, and you just can't paper that over after a certain point.